and welcome. In these 2 issues, we're introduced to the menace of the Moon Knight. Werewolf by Night opens on a fight scene. There's no introduction and no context whatsoever. There's Jack Russell, also known as the werewolf in green jeans, and there is the, costume stalker known as Moon Knight. Both fight it out while a crowd looks on. During the fight, we learn that Moon Knight wears spiked gloves made of silver. His boots contain silver, and he throws silver crescent moons. In fact, his whole costume is lined with silver. Naturally, silver doesn't go well with a werewolf constitution, and Jack is getting the crap kicked out of him. Before Moon Knight can finish beating the werewolf down, we get an extended flashback to the events that led to this fight. Jack is informed a close friend has been hospitalized after an attack. Jack, who cannot control his werewolf self, blames himself for mauling a friend and putting him in a coma. At the hospital, Jack meets up with his sister, Lissa, and her friend, Topaz. After some melodrama, Jack drives home because it's about to get dark and he will soon change into a werewolf. At home, he discovers his stepdad is being held hostage by the Moon Knight. Moon Knight, also known as the mercenary, Mark Spector, then launches into his own flashback/villainous monologue. So, at the moment, we're having a flashback inside of a flashback. One more flashback, and I think that's officially known as an inception. Anyway, Moon Knight explains he was hired by an organization known as the Committee. After listing his impressive mercenary credits, they offer him a costume and $10,000 to capture the Werewolf by Night. Naturally, he takes the costume and the job. Just as his monologue ends, Moon Knight is tackled by Jack's stepdad. Jack escapes, only to turn into the werewolf moments later. Moon Knight and his helicopter pilot henchman, Frenchie, track down Jack and the fight begins, which brings us back to the present. During this fight, Frenchie, armed with a stereotypical French accent and a gun, abducts Lissa and Topaz. Meanwhile, the fight rages on, with Moon Knight knocking out the werewolf. So with Jack, Lissa, and Topaz, Moon Knight makes his escape as the police arrive. In the following issue, the escape is completed, but not without Moon Knight being wounded in the process. For the record, this wound is completely forgotten in roughly 2 panels. The werewolf wakes up and attacks, plunging himself and Moon Knight into the ocean. They fight in the water, then out of the water, then in the water again, and then back on the surface. The werewolf was just about to win the fight, but then dawn breaks. Jack Russell returns to human form and gets beaten down by Moon Knight. Frenchie picks up Moon Knight and, with the unconscious Jack and the 2 hostages, they go to collect their reward. The committee isn't convinced the person Moon Knight brought them is a werewolf, which seems like an odd plot beat. They specifically ask Moon Knight to get Jack Russell, and they know what Jack looks like, but they're still skeptical when they get exactly what they asked for. So they decide to sit around, monologue until enough pages are filled to complete the issue, and wait for night to fall. During this time, a committee member admits he wants the werewolf as a pet, so he can release it every now and then to commit random murders. Night falls, the moon comes out, and Jack changes into the werewolf once again. Moon Knight collects his cash, and then decides he's not a big fan of the committee, so he lets the werewolf free. He also releases the captives, and then makes sure the werewolf has the opportunity to get some sweet revenge on the person who wanted him as a pet. With that, Moon Knight takes off before the feral beast decides to tear into him. In the final panel, he sits on the roof with a handful of cash and a free silver-coated costume. Notably, this first appearance barely resembles the character that has evolved through the years, although there are similarities, such as the Soldier of Fortune background, the name, Mark Spector, and the helicopter pilot, Frenchie, so it's not like the character is completely unrecognizable. But taking a one-off job from a bunch of bored rich people seems pretty out of character, unless there was some other angle Moon Knight was working, which there doesn't seem to be. He's a straight-up mercenary doing work for hire. This appearance does answer why he wears a white costume. Sure, the theme to the character involves the moon, and the moon glows white in the sky, but it always seemed a bit impractical. However, it's not white, it's actually silver to give him an edge against a werewolf. So that does make sense. And it's not a costume he designed, it was something given to him to do a job. Naturally, over the years, the character and his origin will get refined. Refined to the point where he doesn't even vaguely resemble the character in these first appearances. Just to give one an idea of how much refinement went on, in Moon Knight's first solo appearance, in Marvel Spotlight from 1973, it suggested his superpowers were a result of getting bitten by the werewolf. It wouldn't be until his first solo series in 1980 that the origin of his powers includes a resurrection by the Egyptian god Khonshu. And it would be many more years before his multiple identities, which he assumed for practical purposes to solve crimes, become a clinical diagnosis of mental illness. So as a character, this is definitely a humble beginnings type of appearance.